Heroes and villains. I had a number of people ask me, looking forward to this, do I make the cut or not? And if so, which side do I sit on? As with a lot of my presentations, I don't have the black and white answers. What I'm asking you to do is think about this. So there are no spoon-fed answers, and I'm going to give you some bits to think about as we go through. So what can we learn from the heroes and villains that are in diving? So I'll tell you a heroic story. We've got an elite special forces team who have been parachuted in, fast-roped into a major city in Europe because they know there's a terrorist attack about to happen. And they take that task on with the professionalism, as Mark described, and they defeat the terrorists. Well, there we go, right? Thanks very much, everybody. Right, there we go. Cut the thing. So I've sort of built a story. Now, these are the guys that are coming in to solve the problem.
Well, police, get down on the ground! He's getting away with the WMD! I got him! Damn, I missed him!
Got him, Carson. He's heading for the Louvre. Your plans are over.
All right, Sarah! Yeah! All right, team!
Step into it.
All right! Bonjour, everyone. Don't worry, everything is boom. We stopped the terrorists.
Heroes in their own world. World police. Now, I'm going to put some faces up on the slide. Are they heroes or villains? I noticed there's a red hat at the back there. Excellent, nice Cousteau hat. Guy Garman, we already had the discussion here. Hero or villain? David Kincannon, lawyer. I've already spoken to David, and he knows this is up here. Some people like him, some don't. Stockton Rush, hero or villain? What about this guy here? Anybody know him? What about this guy? It's the same guy. He's the actor, and that's Captain Sullenberger. And his quote here, and this ties in with Phil Short's piece, and ties in with Mark's piece, and also Richard's, about experience. The ability to save lives in adverse conditions. Would Sully still be a hero if he crashed into the tower blocks on the way back into LaGuardia and it killed everybody on board the aircraft at that stage? We end up with huge biases that lead us to whether or not people are heroes or villains. Definitions of what or who is a hero. And it's this bit here, the individual struggles against the malevolent forces that are out there. Who are they doing battle with, and who have they won as the outcomes we're talking about? Do we know the heroes, or do we just know the stories behind those heroics? Do you understand why people are heroic, or is it just because of the stories that get told that are out there? So this is one of the things that appears on social media. Is this the villain? The shepherd dog who's attacking the sheep? But in fact, what we need to do is look wider and look at the context. I was trying to find some stories of the opposite way around, heroes that turn into villains. You go to ChatGPT, first hit, Anakin Skywalker turns into Darth Vader. There we go, now the hero, who then turns good again at the end. Heroes in the diving space, Thai Cave Rescue, and the narratives there, and Lee, have seen it back when get all of the team together at Eurotech and tell their story. And the question asked, what would happen if those kids died? And that was a really difficult question, asking. They said, we don't know. And actually the first child went out before they had to, or they were on transit, and they had to send the second child out before they'd known that the first child had made it. Huge pressures involved here. as to whether or not that was going to be successful or failure. And that's one of the things we're trying to do, is understand the stories. And what was interesting is watching this story of 13 lost from other members on that Thai cave rescue. And that's not the one that makes the media in the same way that Richard Harris and the rest of the team did. And if you haven't watched that, it's worth worth watching the other sides of the story. Understand, how did it make sense for people to tell their narratives? I was reading a book by Annie Duke at the moment called Quit. And she talks about these three people. Now, Phil Short might recognize them. Any hands up here who recognizes these three names? These are three guys that turned round in 1996 on the ill-fated Everest expedition. They're the ones that actually had followed the expedition leader's direction that said, if you're not going to make Hillary's step by 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, whatever it was, here's the turnaround time, you have to turn around. And there were some fairly strong discussions about, could they do this? But they went, no, we are going to turn around, and they survived. 8 other people died, including 2 world-class Everest expedition leaders because of pressonitis. And it was really interesting to hear Xavier's discussion about, get further, expedition feeder. I'm going to go and look at the rocks that are down there. And I've got some questions tomorrow based around that. But are they heroes or villains? Do you consider a quitter to be a hero? And Jill's nodding here, and Jill's story of her first trimix class, exactly that piece. And the guilt that sits inside going, have I done the right thing or not? And I'll talk about that in a second. This lady here, Redonda Vort, hand up here who knows this story. American nurse injecting a patient with what she thought was a relaxant, but actually was a massive sedative. And that patient died in an MRI scanner because she basically had suppressed her breathing, and she died as a consequence. She reported that to the hospital staff, and they went, okay, administrative error or drug administration error, we'll run with it. You know, it's one of those things that happens in healthcare. A year later, there was a freedom of information request by the insurance company into the hospital, and she got charged with manslaughter for the loss of that life. And there was a huge investigation, went up to the Supreme Court, and there was a big outcry because he turned around and said, if you're going to charge her for manslaughter, then the learning stops in the healthcare system, because the failures that existed in her system, having to override the drugs cabinets, she was wearing 3 hats at that stage for her job. She was shepherding somebody else, and it was the case of, do this. There should have been protocols to stay with the patient, overworked, couldn't done it. Massive systemic issues that led to the loss of this patient, and it was thrown out. She'd already lost a license, her life was destroyed. So, punishing her for that when her whole life was around nursing would not have helped things. And the reason I put this on here is we bring to the Linnea Mills case, and I have a view about the instructor as being a victim of a broken system. If that instructor didn't know about weighting properly, didn't know about dry suit connections, didn't know about a whole bunch of stuff, is that an individual problem or is that a systems problem? And if you reframe it that way, are they a villain or are they a victim of the system that's there? And that's the point about context. Visual illusions are a great way to get this context, these ideas of context across. So the checkerboards A and B, looking at the shadows that cast from that green cylinder, you'd think that those squares are different. But actually, we draw them that way. And it's a really easy way to get this point across. The same across here. That gray and that white, or that gray and that light gray, are actually the same color. So what goes on around us, and I can see you looking at Lee going, no, it's not. It is. The way that we look at the world shapes, or what's around us shapes our perspective of what's going on. And I think, what on earth has this got to do with heroes and villains? What we need to understand is the stories that are out there. These first stories, these simple stories are the ones that are out there. They get told judgmental, limited, like the shepherd dog bringing the sheep out of the pool. We can then say they're a villain. But actually, they may not be a hero, but they may not be as villainous as we think they are. The messiness of reality, the pressures that are there, the trade-offs that are there. Mark's bit about professionalism and the financial pressures that are there. You sit there and go, well, they should follow the rules. But if everybody's undercutting and everybody's cheap, then actually it becomes really difficult. And in a hobbyist environment where people often have other jobs, they can then undercut the price, which means everybody else then has to drive their prices down. What are the stories that get told? In 2018, I told a story about a diver. I told it in the third person, that they got decompression sickness after a week's worth of trimix diving. They got on the boat. They had some visual disturbances of decompression, of aura. Those went away after about 30 minutes. The boat comes into port. They get on, unloading everything, and the diver gets some more visual disturbances. And I asked the question, so what do you think about that diver? You know, they didn't tell anybody, but they had symptoms, what appeared to be symptoms of decompression sickness. They then flew home from Malta back to the UK. Now what do you think about that diver? And everybody's like, that diver was me. And everybody becomes sort of very deflated. What's the story that's being told, and can we tell those stories? This story here about some guys entering a wreck in Palau, what should have been a 2-hour dive turned into a 5.5-hour dive because they were stuck inside the wreck because the wreck had collapsed around them. And this is their decompression, the computer output, and the flat line that's along the bottom, that's where they're stuck inside the wreck waiting for something to happen. And eventually they got rescued by some people up on the support boat that was going on. And what's interesting here then, and I'll come on to this in a minute, is the perceptions of that person that told the story. So are they externally a hero, but what do they think about their own judgments and their own strengths and weaknesses? And the reason I put wildland firefighting up here is there's a colleague of mine was involved in wildland firefighting at a conference, and a guy was an incident commander, got overrun in wildland firefighting in the States, and they pitched shelters, the fire passed over them, and they survived. They were lucky. They'd missed some critical information, but they'd had a lucky outcome. And he was invited to talk at a conference about what happened. And he was terrified because in his view, had screwed up. He was guilty for what was doing. And he got up there, told his story, and everybody's going, I've been there. I've been there. I've done that. And when he finished, he got a standing ovation from 400 of his peers saying, thank you for sharing that story. And it becomes really hard. The comment of the explorers, there was a comment from, I think, Nuno saying, if you ask deep divers about the accidents they've had, they won't tell you. So how do you learn? And that goes to this point here with Aaron and the rest of the team. He started his presentation that said, I feel very vulnerable up here. I'm about to tell a story about 4 divers who entered a wreck without lining off. Big flags. And then you sit there and go, actually, this is how it made sense. Another thing to consider is how you tell that story. I've got a documentary called If Only, and that is a story told heroically. Ashley Buggy, whose husband died, and the dive team talking about how it made sense for everybody in that environment to have done what they did. That storytelling needs to come out, and it can be very difficult to do so. Because in the diving space, there's this sort of honor amongst thieves. And the number of people who send me a message, or we have a phone call or a chat at a conference, hey Gareth, I'll tell you this. You can't tell anybody else. Great, cheers. I don't want to be the one that is the leak or spills the beans. So how does everybody else learn about this stuff? And that's what, one of my missions is about, is trying to create that culture that allows us to share those stories. If you call things out, Are you a hero or a villain? Anybody, hands up, anybody recognize this? A guy called Ignaz Semmelweis. He's the guy that found out about sort of bacterial infections in in labor ward in Austria. So he couldn't understand why the labor wards, where the surgeons would go and do the deliveries in the afternoon, the majority of those women became very ill, and there was just this fever, and the pregnant young women were really worried and scared about being delivered by a doctor, but the midwives didn't have the same rate. It's like, hang on a minute, this is the same hospital, what's going on? Bear in mind, this is hundreds of years ago, and the reason why the doctors had the high mortality rate is because they would do autopsies in the morning, and they'd still wear their bloodied gowns and their bloodied tools, and then they'd go and help with the deliveries. And any surprise that those young ladies got, ill and died as a consequence? The tragedy was he was pilloried by his peers, and he ended up getting sectioned into a mental hospital and died of sepsis because he was beaten up in the hospital and died, in effect, of the disease that he found out about. So you sit there and go, now everybody goes, yeah, wash your hands. But this guy at that time, another guy, John Barnett, was a guy that committed suicide earlier this year, one of the 2 whistleblowers that died earlier this year from Boeing. And he said a few days beforehand, I can't do this anymore. It's enough. And he'd lost promotion, lots of sort of punishment that was going on, and he decided to end his life, shot himself in a car outside a hotel, and it was waiting for him to go back into court. So, are they heroes or are they villains? What side of the fence do they sit on? And this is my sort of final piece. What can we learn from the heroes and villains and the stories that exist? Our heroes exist because of how we create them. There are heroes in here of the audience because of who they are, the stories they tell, what you believe about them. But one person's hero may be another person's villain. So that black and white approach, not great. Our outcome bias really shifts whether or not somebody is heroic or villainous. What we have to do is dig into the stories that are there. Quitting a dive or a project or anything else like that, when you've got so much committed to it, can be really difficult. And as a consequence, are you heroic? Do others think you are villainous because you've cancelled it? And most people are very time poor rather than money poor when they get involved in some of these projects. Sharing those stories, those events, can be seen villainous because we don't want to share them. We don't want to give people a bad name. Fatalities, to me, are a rubbish way of learning. They're a rubbish way of measuring safety. There are so many variabilities involved. And most of all, you can't ask that person, how did it make sense for them to do what they did? Because normally they're dead. And Nuno was talking so many examples. Oh, there's an equipment failure. We don't know, they died. Great. What happened? We don't know. There are so many near misses, close calls that could be used to share the learning. And we need to dig into those. But we don't have that culture. Challenging the status quo. Going against what's the norm. Richard, I'm sure there are a bunch of people think that he's a villain in the adaptive diving framework, but as a hero, bringing this stuff out, it's not easy. And that brings me to my final point. We like to think of the world in black and white, because then it's easy. We simplify stuff. But there's a huge gray area between right, wrong, black, white, good, bad. These normative terms do not help us grow. What we can do is change the language to be curious. Instead of saying, why did that happen? Why did you do that? Reframe it and say, how did it make sense? Because now I'm looking at your rationality and your decision-making process. If I say to Jill, why did you do that, Jill? I'm asking her to justify her position against my standards. She's going to get defensive. And that ties into Mark Powell's piece about feedback. It's much easier when people find their own answers. You've got to ask the right questions for that. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gareth.